Turkey, like every country, has a right to defend its territory and its airspace. I think it's very important right now for us to make sure that both the Russians and the Turks are talking to each other, find out exactly what happened.
For the first time since the 1950s, a NATO nation has admittedly shot down a Russian military fighter jet. Vladimir Putin is faced with what he calls a stab in the back from a friendly nation. And the Flashpoint incident many feared would happen in the Syrian theater may scuttle any plans for an immediate coalition to fight ISIS. Does this play right into the hands of ISIS, creating another rift between the world powers that must join together to defeat them? And can NATO handle what is increasingly becoming a war theater where no one knows who is shooting at whom? Let's get to it. Our guest is Senior Fellow for Russia at the American Foreign Policy Council, formerly a Professor of National Security Studies at the U.S. Army War College. It's a pleasure to welcome Stephen Blank to the Hard Line. Professor, thank you so much for being here, but let me ask you flat out here first up. Did Turkey knee-jerk on this, in your opinion, or has Russia basically been caught playing far too many games?
From what I can tell in the media, Russia has been caught trying to intimidate Turkey. This is by no means the first such case. Another Russian drone was shot down about a month ago. There have been subsequent Russian incursions into Turkish airspace. The Turks have warned the Russians, and the Russians apparently disregarded those warnings.
When we look at something like this, then, do we have to consider, and again, I know you probably thought of this as many others have as well, that Vladimir Putin is using the attacks in Syria, the attacks against ISIS, as nothing more than an excuse to help push Russia along farther on the world theater and to create more fear in that region?
That's only one reason. There are many reasons why Putin is involved in Syria. Russia does have a terrorist problem, but they also want to play a major role in the Middle East, and they are terrified about Assad being ejected from power because Assad is their guy. They would lose any chance of status in the Middle East, and it would just be another example of America being able to get rid of dictators that Washington doesn't like, and Putin and his team fear that that may be what we have in mind for them.
Now, President Erdogan issued a statement outlining the events of shooting down the Russian jet, and here's what he said. Basically, the unidentified plane warned 10 times in 5 minutes coming towards our borders. It insisted on violating our airspace. Following that, the intervention by our F-16 jets, this plane was shot down. All right, look, Vladimir Putin loses face when something like this happens. What do you think will be his immediate reaction? What are we missing in this equation, how he will react?
Well, I don't think we're missing anything. I think his reaction, calling it a stab in the back, was a sign of what's going to happen. I expect there to be a reaction. I don't know that it's going to be a military one because obviously the fact that NATO is meeting and that Article 4 or 5 might be considered, I think will hold any military action. But I think you're going to see the Russians come after the Turks by cutting gas supplies to Turkey, cutting trade, and putting a lot of pressure on Turkey and threatening it in other ways. But I'm not so certain that you're going to see a direct military operation against Turkey. That's a big escalation that I don't think Putin really wants.
Does NATO have the intestinal fortitude to do what they would need to do? Because quite frankly, there are many people around the world who see NATO many times as nothing more than clawless.
Well, I can't speak for the people who see it as koalas, but the fact is that if there's an Article 5 scenario, if NATO doesn't act, it'll be the end of NATO. And I don't think the Russians really want to pay to see that card turned up, to use a metaphor from poker. I don't think anybody wants to see NATO and Russia go to the mat, and that includes Putin. He will make moves against Turkey. He will retaliate in various ways, but I don't think you're going to see a direct military challenge to Turkey that can be construed as grounds for NATO intervention.
Do you see this as what ISIS would want? Russia being angry at Turkey, the possibility that Russia then may get involved with the Turks, that they may not work with America. Do you think that ISIS sees this as just the perfect unsettling moment that will basically help them in the long run?
Well, I'm sure they're happy about it. But the fact of the matter is that the chances for a coalition between the United States and Russia, even before this, were slim at best. And if you heard President Hollande today at the White House, he said that in regard to Assad must go now. Well, that makes it impossible for there to be a real French-Russian coalition right there. And that's our position as well. So the basis for a coalition wasn't even there before this Turkish incident happened. So, yeah, I'm sure ISIS is very happy about this, but I wouldn't exaggerate its impact on the prospects for forming a coalition. The Russians haven't attacked ISIS for the most part. They've attacked other groups that are anti-Assad. The only time they attacked ISIS is last week as a result of the fact that they admitted that their plane had been blown up by ISIS. But the Russian operations are not against ISIS, and they may talk a big game, but they're not carrying one out.
I only got about 15 seconds left here. Is it possible that United States, we cannot defeat ISIS until we first get Russia out of Syria and get Assad out of Syria at the same time, both of which seem impossible?
I'm not certain about that, but the problem in Syria is so great now that what it will take to defeat ISIS goes far beyond the question of whether Assad is there or not. You're not going to defeat ISIS, in my view, unless you have a major ground force and a major political program that can appeal to that constituency. And until that happens, bombing alone will not do the job.
You brought some logic to this conversation. Professor Stephen Blank, I want to thank you very much for your time. The Hard Line continues.